So I'm going to be presenting some work that's a continuation of work I've been doing with Rethink Priorities about how to think about alternatives to maximizing expected utility, looking at other sorts of decision theories and the results that they yield. And one of the kind of decision theories that we explored was a certain kind of risk aversion that's been really severely under-theorized in the literature. And so we rely on it, but we have a lot of questions about whether it can be fleshed out in some reasonable way and whether it's a decision procedure we should follow. So this is going to be an exploration of that. I should also mention that this is not going to be sort of like a knockdown argument in favor of difference-making risk aversion. It's going to be more like a smattering of considerations that might make us think about it a little bit differently, or give us some more credence in it, or sort of raise some questions that would be interesting to talk about. So at the highest level, this talk is about what does it mean to do the most good? And so to answer this question, right, there are different theories about what it means to do the most. And there are different theories about what the good is that is relevant. And I'm going to be addressing the latter concern here. And more specifically, we're going to be asking, when we are aiming at doing the most good, what is the thing that we're aiming at? And the most natural interpretation is that we're aiming at the best overall state of the world. What we want our actions to do is sort of we measure them in terms of how good or bad the world is, or some subset of the world, as the result of our actions. Now, focusing on the absolute value is consistent with different strategies for doing the most. So obviously you could maximize expected utility or value, but you also might be standardly risk averse. So you might think the sort of absolute values I care about the most are the worst case scenarios. So I'm going to put extra decision weight on those and try to avoid those. But what you're still concerned with is some aspect of the absolute value of the world. It also seems to me consistent with rounding down expected value. Petra has written a really helpful paper about that, where you're saying, hey, I'm concerned about the absolute value, but only those outcomes that are sufficiently probable. An alternative to focusing on the best overall state of the world is focusing on the difference that is yielded by our actions compared to had we done nothing. So here you can focus on the relative value, the value conditional on our action sort of minus the value conditional on doing nothing. I acknowledge that how to cash out this conditional and how to cash out doing nothing is complicated, but I'm going to put those aside. We have enough problems. And then this is compatible also with several strategies for doing the most. If you're maximizing expected value, it's not going to matter whether you measure in terms of absolute or relative value, but it is going to matter when you pair assessments of relative value with what I'll call avoid making things worse risk aversion. So at the risk of being pedantic, let's describe a difference-making risk-averse agent. So she's one who evaluates actions by the difference her action yields compared to had she not acted. She's risk-averse, so if you are risk-averse to something of value, so for something of value X, you prefer a sure thing value of that to something that has the same expected value but has higher uncertainty or variance. So if you put these together in one particular way, you get what I'll call avoid the worst difference-making risk aversion. So what she is particularly averse to is situations where she makes things worse as a result of her actions, or where she has no difference whatsoever. She makes no difference whatsoever, okay? So she thinks about ranks all of the relative values her action could create, and she puts extra decision weight on the worst ones because she really doesn't want to have that happen. Okay, so she wants to make a positive difference. So I think that this kind of attitude yields intuitively plausible results about what we should do in certain paradigm cases that I'll run through, or what we're permitted to do. It also seems like it's the plausible psychological explanation of what actual agents, why agents have the preferences that they do. So it might actually be a common kind of attitude. But as I said, it's under-theorized, and the sort of main work that's taken it on explicitly is highly critical of it by a smattering of people in the room here. And it's a really excellent paper that levels some really serious challenges against this view. So what I'm going to do is, again, this is not going to be a knockdown argument in favor of being difference-making risk-averse, but explore some of these objections to it and what can be said in its defense. Okay, so the outline of the talk. I'm going to look at certain difference-making risk-averse decision theories and their results for certain cases. I'm going to reconstruct the Greaves et al. GMMT arguments against being difference-making risk averse. And then we can consider two kinds of defenses that you could have. So the first one is methodological, that says, look, what we ultimately care about is absolute value, but caring about the relative value is sort of an effective local strategy for achieving the total good. You might think like, well, I'll get there, what you might think. But the idea is that it's sort of like extrinsically valuable because it's a useful strategy for achieving the best overall good. Then I'll shift to one that says, no, actually difference-making risk aversion like captures something that's intrinsically valuable, making like the relative difference that you make is of intrinsic value, and so it makes sense to be risk averse with respect to that thing of value. So what could be sort of a moral defense of that attitude? So here are three cases in which I hope to elicit some of these intuitions in you. The first two come from the GMMT paper, and the last one I'll add on top. So here's the first case. Suppose you have a certain amount of money to give to charity, and you've got three choices. You can give all of it to Against Malaria Foundation, or you can give all of it to Unlimit Health, which is the rebranding of the schistosomiosis initiative. Or you could diversify your giving some of it to one and some of it to the other. Suppose that the probability that your charitable donation will do any good is 50% for each of these, right? And that the probability of their failure is independent of one another, okay? So the single cause, giving to the better overall charity that has the higher EV, is the highest EV thing you can do. However, a lot of people have preferences for diversification. They want to split the pot between the two. And the reasoning seems to be that you have a 50% chance of failure if you put all your eggs in one basket, but you only have a 25% chance of doing no good if you split the money because their failure rates are independent of each other. So a lot of people prefer to take the one where they have a higher probability of making a difference. They're averse to situations where they just threw their money away. Another case is cause prioritization. So suppose you can give your money to X risk mitigation or to AMF. And suppose that the probability that your donation actually makes a difference to averting some catastrophe is like minuscule. Whereas giving some Against Malaria is bound to do something, but of less magnitude. Suppose for the sake of argument that X risk has higher EV. Still a lot of people have this intuition that it's at least permissible to give it to AMF, and in part because you have a higher probability of actually making a difference. Here's a third case where you're choosing between actions to benefit beings of uncertain moral status. So here's an example. Suppose with a given amount of money, you could help shrimp by, say, lowering ammonia concentrations at shrimp farms or doing humane stunning. You could help 100 million individuals because there are 6 trillion shrimp that get killed on farms every year. We assume that they have a really small welfare range, that they don't have the amount of utility you would add per individual is very small, and assume that you think the probability that shrimp are sentient is 0.1, okay? Even given all of that, you can show that that action will have a higher expected value than an action to help humans that have a much greater welfare range and are certainly sentient. So this is what Jeff Sebo calls the repugnant conclusion. A lot of people have this idea that we ought to be helping humans, or they prefer to help humans, and one way to catch that out is that you are helping some individuals for whom things can go better and worse, whereas you only have a 10% chance of that happening if you give to shrimp. Okay, so these preferences, I think, are I agree, fairly widespread. And then there's a question of how should we model this. So when we started trying to do this at Rethink, here's the strategy we took. I don't know if it's the correct strategy, but at least I can tell you what it was. What we did is we started with 2 accounts of standard avoid the worst risk aversion. So Lara Buchak's REU and Tim's WLU theory that differ in the following way. So both of them put extra decision weight on the worst case outcomes of your actions. However, Buchak basically discounts better outcomes as a function of their probability, whereas WLU discounts them as a function of their utility. And so what we did is we just took these on board, and then we adjusted these for DMRA. So one way you can do this is just, and Arvo's trying to figure out how to do this right now, is just to replace sort of wherever you put absolute value in these risk models, just put the relative value. So basically, like, how much value was it adding above the baseline is what you can do. Another way you can think about this is that the total payoff of your actions is going to be the sum of whatever value is in the background plus the value achieved by your action. So one thing we can do is just say, subtract out the background and set that to 0, and then input basically just the amount of difference over 0. I'm just going to run through this really quickly. We can talk about it more. But so, for example, here's Buchak's REU theory. So you redescribe the expected value of an action by saying, here are all of the possible outcomes. You have a 100% chance of getting the worst outcome, plus some probability of jumping up to getting the next step up, plus some probability of getting the next step up. And then what she does to apply risk is to have a risk factor that says, I'm going to square those probabilities, as an example. So if you had a 10% chance of getting one step up of value, you've now multiplied that, so the probability weight's much smaller. So basically, you're putting much more weight on the worst things that could happen. Basically, we just do this in a really simple way. We just replace the absolute value with just the difference that you make. I should say I haven't tried to prove any representation theorems with this or anything. It's a stab, but you'll let me know if it's a bad one, as most stabs are. Then here's another alternative. So we looked at weighted linear utility theory that says, look, rank all the outcomes from sort of worst to best, and then just like you have declining marginal utility, do that again. Right? So that as outcomes get better and better and better and better, you put less and less weight on them as a function of their utility. So what we did to turn this into a DMRA account is just basically for X, we just put the amount of value you created. Basically, we set the background amount of value to 0. So we only considered things as a function of how much utility is added. So if you do this, here's just one example. If you apply these decision theories to shrimp versus humans, you see that if you apply Buchak's REV theory, that makes helping shrimp look even better than helping humans than standard EV does. And the reason is that the worst case scenario is that shrimp are suffering in the trillions, and you want to be really sure to avoid that. On the other hand, if you're difference-making risk averse, you're going to say, what I'm sensitive to is not the probability just that they're suffering great numbers, but that my action will make a difference. And that is we're certain that your action will make a difference with humans. It's very improbable with shrimp. This is Laura Duffy showing up in 2 talks in a row. So my former colleague, Laura Duffy, basically ran a whole bunch of different projects through these different difference-making decision theories to see what they said. And so you can look at sort of risk-neutral EV maximization on the left. Green means better, red means worse by the lights of that decision theory. And you can see that something like a long-term risky X-risk project has a very high risk-neutral EV maximization and a very low score according to difference-making risk-averse theories. She came up with different numbers about shrimp because she thinks that the actual sheer amount of value overwhelms the difference-making risk aversion. Okay, so I should say, right, these risk-averse models are sensitive to the probability of making a difference and how big that difference would be if you made it. So you can get some risky things still turn out okay. Okay, so those are the results. Like I said, I think the best paper on this raises some really serious objections, so let's look at what those are. Here's the minimal argument that they actually sort of promote in the paper. Goes like this. People display preferences P, so they prefer GHD over X-risk, humans over shrimp, and so on. The best explanation of that is that they are difference-making risk averse. Difference-making risk aversion is inconsistent with pure benevolence. Therefore, people's motivations for P are inconsistent with pure benevolence. Okay. So if this argument is sound, here's what it wouldn't show. It wouldn't show that these instances of difference-making risk averse yield different results than pure benevolence would, right? So there's something wrong with the attitude that it's inconsistent with pure benevolence sort of overall, but it doesn't show that these are bad applications that's going to give a different result from pure benevolence. This also wouldn't show by itself that people's motivations are not all things considered morally good. So it might be that benevolence points in favor of some things, but there are morally weighty things pointing you in favor of making a difference, and that these conflict in this case, right? But there's another argument that's at least implied or suggested in the Greaves et al. Paper. I'm not saying that it's necessarily, stood behind, but let me just like juice up the argument to see the stronger version we can get. So to go from this minimal argument to an expanded one, look at this following quote. A natural diagnosis is that what is going on in all these cases is sort of pseudo-benevolence rather than a genuine article. Perhaps, for instance, what's really driving the preferences in question is a desire to render one's own life in some sense more meaningful rather than a direct desire that the world be better. It might then not be surprising that the corresponding behavior is in tension with benevolence, since the desire for meaningfulness is not straightforwardly a matter of benevolence. So let's turn this into a stronger argument, maybe stronger than the author's intent. If people's preferences P are not justified by some other morally weighty considerations, then they're not all things considered morally good. The best explanation for people's difference-making risk aversion is that they're motivated by a desire to enhance the meaning of their own lives. The desire to enhance the meaning of one's own life is not morally weighty. Therefore, people's preferences for P are not all things considered morally good. Okay. So I'm going to sort of like the rest of the talk is going to be sort of addressing these two arguments in turn. I'm just going to note and then walk away from the claim that I have my doubts that difference-making risk aversion is necessarily the right explanation of what people's judgments are. I think something like rounding down EV maximization might do a better job of explaining what people are actually up to, but I'm going to leave that aside. So the next thing I'm going to do is talk about sort of this kind of argument you could make that says actually difference-making risk aversion is like a strategy for achieving benevolence and therefore is consistent with it. And then I'll look at sort of the expanded argument and sort of gesture to a few moral considerations that would tell in favor of difference-making risk aversion that are morally weighty. So even if you don't think it's consistent with pure benevolence, you might think there's something to it. Okay, so I want to make a preliminary point that I think it will sort of help color or make more plausible some of the claims I'll make going forward. So as we saw in the quote earlier, the authors think that, like, look, people are motivated by a desire to make their own lives more meaningful, and certainly EA's pitch sometimes is put in those terms. But now just consider this case. Imagine that Jane has been giving millions of dollars combating human childhood malnutrition. And she's considering redirecting all of this money towards improving conditions at insect farms. And suppose that you are really pessimistic about insect sentience and you think that the probability of their sentience is like 1%. Okay. I have a response to her action, which is like, that seems really, really risky, what you're doing. There's a 99% chance that you're just lighting millions of dollars on fire, right? As you help humans, you're certain to make a difference for two things for whom things can go better and worse, right? So I have like strong objections to like Bill Gates just turning to insects welfare. Don't let Bob Fisher hear me say that. Anyway, I have this strong attitude that there's something wrong with this. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that I think people's preferences for P persist even when they're evaluating actions by other people, not just themselves. And I think I object to Jane's actions even if I'm not causally implicated in them at all, has no bearing on the meaning of my life. And it's not because I'm worried that Jane's life will lack meaning, right? So whatever this remainder is, it seems like it's something that's more agent neutral than sort of Greaves et al. Characterize it as being. I think there's something left over, an intuition I'm trying to pump. Okay. So for the methodological defense, and this is going to be a bit of a garden path, hopefully one that takes us by some interesting scenery. We'll see. Okay, so here's the proposal that I'll try to make good on, or see if it can be made good on. If we're risk averse and we're highly uncertain about the background state of the world, then we should just focus on the difference that our actions make. We should ignore that background of which we're highly uncertain. And here's the hope that doing this will be an effective local strategy for maximizing the overall good. I have no idea what's going out there in the universe, but I know what my actions will do. And by making my actions as good as I can, that might be a way of trying to promote the overall good in the world. Here's another hope. This is going to give a version of risk aversion that won't just reduce to expected value maximization. All right, so here's the sort of this intuitive thought. We often have much better epistemic access to the difference that our actions will make than to the overall amount of value they'll produce, right? And if Jeff is right, there are huge problems thinking about that in an infinite world. Erring on the side of actions that will likely increase the good is a local strategy for achieving the overall good, especially if you're risk averse and especially if you care about things like the probability of success or the probability of disaster. Here's an analogy. Maybe I'm comparing it to something that people hate even worse. But like Frank Jackson has this really nice paper about whether consequentialism is consistent with partiality to one's nearest and dearest. And he's like, look, with a lot of ways the world could be set up, actually having people care more about their nearest and dearest and be partial to them is like a really effective local strategy for achieving the best overall good. That can fall apart when there are coordination problems and stuff like that. But in some cases, partiality is a local strategy for maximizing overall utility, and it's generated by special epistemological access to our nearest and dearest, right? So there might be something like that going on for relative good. I'll talk about objections to this in a second. I know we're looking. Here's another hope. This is more just sort of like autobiographical about how this actually happened when we tried to implement these models. Risk aversion models, when we tried to like apply standard RAU or WLU to some of these real world cases, we ran into a problem. Risk aversion models are highly sensitive to the absolute value of states, or the background were you to do nothing, right? So standard risk aversion cases. After all, this is exactly what LA cases were trying to tell us, right? Which is that like the same gamble can be evaluated differently depending on what the background state is. So kind of pithily, when the stakes are small relative to the background, then you should be less risk averse. And when do nothing has a high probability of being pretty bad, then you should also be less risk averse. So if you're a billionaire gambling on $1, you should just not be risk averse about trying to save that dollar. Likewise, if you're deciding whether you should like invest in fusion research or like build higher levees, which of those you should do probably depends on your judgment about how bad climate change is going to be were you to do nothing, right? If you think that we're all doomed to die in 50 years, you should take the long shot and try to get cold fusion to get off the ground. But if you think everything's going to be kind of okay, maybe you can be more risk averse and do the more sure shot thing of building levees. But here's the problem, is that we're massively uncertain about the background value. We didn't know what to input when we tried to do these models. So here's an example. Suppose that you're thinking about giving to charity and you either have an 80% chance of adding 10 units of value to the world or a 20% chance of adding 60 units. Okay, go back to these risk aversion models. What values should you put in for the resultant states? One is you could just do background is 0. Put in 10 and 60 as the possible values that you're considering. Another is you consider the overall value in the state of your population affected, so the total qualities in your population plus 10 or plus 60. Or do you take the entire value of the universe and add either 10 or 60? What should you count as the value that obtains? And so for example, if you plug these into WLU, there's a big difference between expected value and WLU's evaluations of this action if the background is 0. But at a background of 1 million units of value, they just converge basically to be the exact same thing. So the problem here is that, like, from the point of view of the universe, all of our bets are small potatoes, right? All of them are like really small stakes. And so there's a worry that using these standard risk aversion models just doesn't give us anything different when applied to large world cases. And Joanna Toma's been complaining about this for other reasons against Lara Buchek's theory for a while. Okay, so what's the problem with this local strategy thing? I'm going to focus on one argument that comes from the Greaves et al. Paper. I'm going to leave aside the sort of like interagent coordination problems because, again, too many problems already. And the problem is that sometimes being difference-making risk-averse can lead you to being stochastically dominated, okay? So we say that an action B stochastically dominates A when for all possible outcome values that you could achieve, the probability of getting at least that good of an outcome is at least as high on B as on A, okay? I'll give you an example in a minute. So for example, if you could either get like 0, 10, or 20, and one option always makes getting at least 0 just as probable, at least 10 is probable, at least 20 just as probable, that one stochastically dominates the other. It's extremely plausible to me that preferring A to B in this circumstance would be inconsistent with benevolence, because whatever you care about in the world, one always does better. And it's also extremely plausible to me that this is a requirement of rationality, that preferring A to B is rationally impermissible. So here's their argument for why difference-making risk aversion will violate stochastic dominance. So take these bets on the left, A and B. So we have a 50-50 coin flip, heads or tails. You can see that B is going to stochastically dominate A, right? So it's a better bet. Why? Because they give an equal probability of getting 10, an equal probability of getting at least 20, and there's some outcome, getting 20 plus X, that B makes more probable. And if you just sort of zoom out, you can be like, looking at those payoffs, clearly B is the better bet. However, when you measure these not in terms of their absolute value, but their relative value, you can see that A is always going to give you, does this work? Nope. Always going to give you plus 10 over the situation where you do nothing. And the other one is going to give you an expected value of 10 plus X over 2, but with much more variance. So a difference-making risk-averse agent is going to prefer A to B because they're sure to make a difference, and the other one is chancy. So in the Buchak-inspired GMRA model, this will be true whenever X is less than 20, right? The difference-making risk-averse agent will prefer it. Okay, so here's the argument, and it's formidable. If B stochastically dominates A, then B better promotes the good. A purely benevolent agent will prefer A to B if and only if A better promotes the good. For some options A and B, a DMRA agent prefers A to B, and B stochastically dominates A. Therefore, a DMRA agent will not be purely benevolent. So adopting this strategy can lead you to cases in which you prefer what seems like obviously a worse outcome. What can be said in response to this? Well, one thing to say is, right, this kind of argument is just exactly what's supposed to show what's wrong with local strategies, right? Something that looks like really good in isolation, when you zoom out and consider the background, you can see as a bad thing. So I see what can say to respond. So one thing you might question is either premise 3 or the validity of this argument. So you might think, look, if I'm a difference-making risk-averse agent, but I make sure that I never apply it in the cases that go really bad, then I might act completely consistently with benevolence, despite the fact that I sometimes have these preferences, right? So here's an analogy. Sometimes I think EV maximization is great. I don't want to do it in fanatical cases. And I'm kind of fine being like a little bit of like a pluralist about like, you don't have to apply the exact same decision theory in every single one of your decisions. Alan Hayek has a nice sort of paper defending that or exploring that. Some people find that like totally gerrymandered and question begging and bad, but I'm kind of, I don't know, life is complicated. So are there ways to prevent ourselves from being stochastically dominated and making the bad decision? I think there are, right? So here are some certain safeguards that you could have. So you can look for sufficient conditions for not being stochastically dominated. So for example, if the background is independent of our action payoffs, and if A's worst case scenario is always better than B's, then A will not be stochastically dominated by B, right? In the case that we considered though, the background states were not independent. Like there was this correlation between sort of like the state of the background and the state of the payoffs. Here, the state in which B pays off is worse, and the amount that B pays off more than compensates for that difference, right? And like that seems like a thing you might be able to test for if you're asking, like, is this local strategy gonna lead to the overall best state? And then you can also sort of like generate the range of background conditions in which B is going to stochastically dominate A, and if you think those are sufficiently unlikely, then maybe you are confident you can avoid it. I don't like this argument that I've given for a lot of reasons, but one of them is this: the dialectic has just gotten really weird. I said, look, we chose to be DMRA because we're totally uncertain about the background value. And then I say, look at the background value, and maybe you can use that to safeguard yourself against being stochastically dominated. And I'm like, but we can't help ourselves to that. Like, that's a worry. And things get even worse, as Christian Tarzny has pointed out. If you condition on uncertainty about the background, on almost all kinds of uncertainty you would have, if action B has a higher expected value than A, then B will almost always stochastically dominate A, unless the probability of getting a lower background value falls off rapidly. So he thinks like in fanatical cases, this might not work, but he's like, look, if you're totally uncertain, you should just think like, if I'm not maximizing expected value, then I'm probably getting stochastically dominated too. So here's this dilemma, and maybe if you don't like any risk aversion, this is just where you want to like tune out. In large world cases with massive uncertainty, risk aversion either seems to favor choices that get stochastically dominated or converge to expected value maximization, right? Because if you ignore the background, then there's this risk of getting stochastically dominated. And if you include the background, then you're just expected value maximizing. Just a few things to say about this. I think sometimes we do have some access to the background value, right? So like, you know, the world in which X risk pays off, is that world like always going to be better than a world in which X risk never occurred? No, probably not, right? Like there are things that we can do to say like, hey, are we going to be violating stochastic dominance here? Another thing we could say is that in many Tarzny cases, neither bet stochastically dominates the other, conditional on any precise background value, but B stochastically dominates A, conditional on uncertainty over background values. And that's kind of weird, right? I'm not super convinced by the generality of his argument. You could take the modus ponens and say there's something really wrong with your preferences if they lead you to that weird conclusion. Another thing you could do is just take the modus ponens and say that's why you shouldn't conditionalize on uncertainty. Like the uncertainty of the background should not be within the thing you're conditionalizing on. And the last thing I can say about this is just like, look, yeah, the background might be lurking and leaving us open to being stochastically dominated. But if we're genuinely ignorant of the background and have no access to it, maybe we should ignore it, right? Maybe it's rational to make decisions on the things that you do know, as opposed to things you're highly uncertain about. And if you have some uncertainty or ambiguity avoidance, maybe that's going to be compelling to you. Okay, so let's just conclude this. The stochastic dominance and collective defeat argument is designed to show just what's wrong with local strategies. A defensive local strategy is most plausible when you can safeguard yourself against the bad cases, and when there's no better thing you could do given your uncertainty, okay? I have some optimism that you can safeguard yourself. I have some optimism that there's no better thing you can do given uncertainty, but I think the easy response here is to say you can always just maximize expected value, right? And if one of maximizing expected value's chief competitors, which is avoid the worst risk aversion, comes out looking worse as a result of my argument, then you might think, yeah, just maximize EV to be on the safe side. Okay. So briefly, I'm going to turn to a different kind of defense of GMRA, that making a difference is intrinsically valuable. Right, so again, we'll be looking for sort of alternative explanations for why people are difference-making risk averse that are morally weighty. Right, I think like if there is something of value, sometimes it makes sense to be risk averse about that thing of value, right? To make sure you have it and not risk losing it. So here are two approaches. So they mentioned in their paper that maybe there are some like deontological reasons for being difference-making risk averse. The first kind of considerations I'll give are like that says, look, the relationship between an agent and the difference she actually makes is morally weighty. It matters. But the second one is less deontological, which is like value grounded, that the amount of change in value, not just the absolute value, is morally weighty or morally important, right? So, which is just to say, like, absolute value is not the only thing we should take into consideration, but how much the value changed is also morally considerable. Here, I'm just going to do a lot of like gesturing to things that might elicit good intuitions, but I'm not going to pretend that it's like a full-fledged argument. Okay, First, let's talk about meaning making, which is the first kind of thing that was proposed as the reason people are difference-making risk averse. I agree that making a meaning out of one's own life is not that morally weighty. You might have different intuitions, right? But again, that's often trotted out as like, hey, you think that your life is like a day trader is like maybe useless, but you can become a hero by giving all that money away. Like that really appeals to a lot of people. But I think that this proposal is even more plausible when we consider that the agent in question is like a moral community or humanity, right? Like when we consider like risk aversion in the like agent neutral way. So if we put all of our resources as humans into helping non-sentient shrimp, or staving off an AI apocalypse that has no objective chance of occurring, there does seem something like really bad about that scenario. And it's not just that we could have done something else with the money, but it seems to be sort of like squandering the things that seem to matter to lots of people about the human project, like knowledge and progress, and like it seems like a squandering of our goodwill. Yeah, I'm not convinced by this, but I think it resonates a tiny bit. I think more promising will be look at moral theories on which being an actual cause of good outcomes matters morally. And so here are a couple of things, sort of like the connection between you and the consequences of your actions makes a difference. So for example, on views in which the degree of agential involvement in bringing out the effect is relevant to the moral worth of an action. So performing an action where you got lucky and the background value made up, like you ended up in the good case, is not as important as one where you brought about that outcome. And then say like what outcomes matter, and it's not just probabilistic profiles, it's what actually happens. So a lot of people have the intuitions in moral luck cases, right? That two people can raise the probability of an event to some same probability, but there's a different moral worth depending on whether or not the outcome actually occurred, right? So Arvo and I both drunk drive, risking a 10% chance of killing a kid. If I get unlucky and a kid actually runs out in front of my car and I kill a kid, I'll be judged much more severely than Arvo because of the actual sort of consequences of my actions, even though we probabilistically promoted those to the same extent. Whether this is defensible, I don't know, but people have these intuitions. And similarly, I like the way that Broom puts it, the fact that something good might have happened is not itself something good that did happen, right? So people evaluate things like goodness and fairness by like, what did you actually do? Not like, what things did you make possible? And so if you care that like your moral worth of your actions depends on the actual stuff that happened, you might be risk averse to say, I want to make sure that I make some good stuff happen, not just this probability of something big. Lastly, this is super speculative. You might think that like relative value matters, not just absolute value. Okay, so here's the analogy that we know from shape of a life objections, right, to hedonism. Or not even objections, just, I don't know, elaborations. So 2 lives can have the same amount of happiness, contain the same amount of happiness, but we think that sort of like the trajectory of that life matters. So a lot of people think that a life that starts out really good and gets really bad is worse than a life that starts out really bad and gets really good, or one that stays sort of at stasis. Similarly, some people think that like a life that starts bad and gets better can be better than a life that starts good and gets bad, even if the latter contains more absolute value underneath it. And what people seem to be responding to is something like changes in value are intrinsically valuable. Things getting better is a good thing. It's not just the absolute value that matters. Again, some people think it's because relative value is intrinsically valuable. Some people think it reflects other things like important projects. But the idea is that like if you do have that intuition, you might have that intuition like writ large, right? A world or a person's life that like makes things better. We should evaluate not just where it ended up, but how it got there. If you have that intuition, you might have an intuition that like something is intrinsically valuable at relative value, but increases in value, and you can be risk averse with respect to that. Making things worse isn't bad just because things end up badly, but because things got worse. Okay. So here are some future questions, if we think this is even worth pursuing. How should we formulate difference-making risk aversion? Who's the relevant agent? Is it an individual, a moral community, humanity in general? Related to this is what should we think of as making a difference? In the causation literature, raising the objective chance of a good outcome counts as making a difference. Or do you have to be the actual cause of a good outcome in order to count as making a difference? My intuitions are in both places. I think that if you reduce the objective risk of a nuclear war by 1%, you've made a difference, even if the nuclear war never was going to happen. Just like wasn't actually in this world going to happen. Suppose we place some credence on this being a relevant thing to take into consideration. How should we manage metanormative uncertainty about different kinds of risk aversion versus risk neutrality? How will this affect our first order decision making, considering, as we saw, that this yields the opposite result of some other risk averse preferences? And then just the final thought is, can all the intuitive results of difference-making risk aversion be captured by some other theory that only uses relative value? Something like rounding down, where you only consider the probable things that will occur as the result of your action, not improbable ones. I have my suspicions that you might be able to capture people's preferences here, explain them without as much of the baggage that DMRE might have. All right, thanks.